Story number 23 of the stories Polly Pepper told. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The story Polly Pepper told to the 5 little peppers in the little brown house by Margaret SIDNEY. The China Mug. "Oh no, I won't have them on," declared little Dick, shaking his head savagely, till it seemed as if every one of the little bits of brown paper must fly off. "Oh, Dickie," exclaimed Polly in dismay, "you bumped your head so falling downstairs." "Haven't bumped my head," cried Dick, swirling around so that none of the children could investigate the big lumps on his head. "I wish they'd all tumble off," and he gave another vigorous shake that made the biggest piece of wet brown paper settle over his left eye. "Very well," said Polly coolly. "We must go to Mrs. Whitney, then, and tell her you are shaking off all the brown paper. I was going to tell you a story, but we can have it now." Little Dick plucked off the big bit of wet brown paper from his eye and looked at her. "I'll stick them on again," he said. "Very well," said Polly once. "I'll put them back. That's a good boy." And she proceeded to do so, till Dick was ornamented with the brown paper bits all in the right places. "Now, says I, as Grandma Bascom used to say, we'll have the story. I'm going to tell you about the China Mug." "I'm glad of that," said Jasper, "because that's one of the stories that we had on baking days in the little brown house. Do you remember, Polly?" "As if we could ever forget," cried Polly happily. And thereupon ensued such a "Do you remember this?" and "Oh, you haven't forgotten that in the little brown house," that the Whitney children fell into despair, and began to implore that the story might begin at once. "You're always talking of the good times in the little brown house," cried Van, who never could forgive Jasper for his good fortune in having been there. "Can't help it," said Jasper, showing signs of rushing off again in reminiscence. So Polly hastened to say, "We really ought not to talk any more about it, but get on with the story. Well, you know, the China Mug was our China Mug, and it stood on the left corner of the shelf in the kitchen of the little brown house." "Is it a true story?" glamoured Van. "Oh, you mustn't ask me," cried Polly gaily, who wasn't going to be called from the land of fancy just then by any questions. "Don't interrupt, any of you," said Jasper, "or I'll ask Polly not to tell about the China Mug. You would better keep "Don't interrupt, any of you," said Jasper, "or I'll ask Polly not to tell about the China Mug. You would better keep still, for it's a fine story, I can tell you." So Van doubled himself up in a ball on the corner of the big sofa, and subsided into quiet, and Polly began once more. "Yes, the China Mug was really and truly our China Mug, on the left corner of the shelf in the kitchen of the little brown house. It was a very old mug. Oh, I don't know how many years old, 200 or 300, I guess. For you see, it was our father's mug when he was a little boy, and his father had it when he was a little boy, and—" "Did they all drink milk from it?" broke in little Dick, forgetting all about the indignity of having his head plastered up with bits of wet brown paper. "All those little boys, Polly?" "Yes, I suppose so," said Polly, "for you see, they were all called Samuel, and every Samuel in the family had this mug, so—" "I wish I could be Samuel and have a mug that was in the little brown house," said Dick reflectively. "Well, it had a funny twisted handle," said Polly, running on, "and oh, the loveliest lady with a pink sash on and long floating hair, and she had a basket of roses on one arm, and she was picking up her gown and courtesying just like this." Polly jumped to her feet, executed a most remarkable courtesy. "Was she standing on the handle?" asked Percy, who was a fancy for all minute details. "Oh dear me, no," said Polly, laughing merrily, and she nearly fell on her nose as she just finished the courtesy. "She couldn't stand on the handle. She was on the front of the China Mug, to be sure. And there was a most beautiful little man, and he had a cocked hat under his arm, and he was bowing to her as she courtesied." "Tell how the beautiful little man bowed," begged the children. So Polly, who had hopped into her seat, had to jump up again, and show them just exactly how the beautiful little man, with the cocked hat under his arm, bowed to the lovely lady with a pink sash on, and a basket of roses hanging on her arm. Then she hurried back, quite tired out, to her place. He had on a blue coat, and his hair was all white, and— "Oh, Polly, was he so very old?" cried Van from his sofa corner. "Dear me, no," said Polly again. "He was young and most beautiful. But his hair was powdered, just as the man is in the big picture in the drawing room, and it was tied up in the back with a bow of ribbon, just like that one too, and he had buckles on his foot and on his shoes, just the very same. Well, he kept bowing all the time, and the lovely lady with the pink sash on and the basket of roses hanging on her arm kept courtesying to him all the time, and they had been doing that for 200 or 300 years. "Oh, Polly Pepper!" exclaimed Percy, quite shocked. "How could they bow and courtesy for 200 years?" "Well, they did," said Polly, hurrying on, "and, if you interrupt again, out you go," from Jasper. And at last one night when we were all abed, Manzy and Phronsie and I in the bedroom, and the 3 boys in the loft, all of us fast asleep, suddenly the beautiful little man exclaimed, "I'm quite tired of bowing to you." "And I'm quite exhausted courtesying to you all the time," declared the lovely lady. "And I shall stop bowing, and turn my back on you," said the beautiful little man. "And I shall not courtesy again, but I shall turn my back on you," said the lovely lady. "And I shall walk away," said the beautiful little man. "And I shall walk away from you," declared the lovely lady. And so they both rolled around and walked away as fast as ever they could from each other. And when they got to the funny twisted handle on the back of the mug, the lovely lady went under it, but the beautiful little man hopped over it quickly, and on they both hurried. And the first thing either of them knew, they were in the front of the mug, staring into each other's faces as they went by. And so round and round the mug they walked, and they never spoke when they passed each other, except to say, "I shall not bow to you, and I shall not courtesy to you." And then away they went again. Oh, it was too dreadful to think of. And at last they had been going on, around and around, 2,000,000 times, I guess, and the lovely lady's poor feet had become so tired out that she could hardly step on them, and she sobbed out to herself. She had just passed a beautiful little man on the front of the mug, so he couldn't see her. "I know I shall drop down and die if I keep on like this." So she gave a great jump, and she flew clearly over the edge of the mug and hopped down inside. "Oh, oh!" screamed little Dick in transport. And when the beautiful little man came stepping around to the front of the mug the next time, lo and behold, there was no lovely lady with a basket of roses hanging on her arm to say, "I won't courtesy to you." "How glad I am that that tiresome creature has gone," he exclaimed as he skipped off around the mug, and he said it the next time in. "I don't think he was nice at all," observed little Dick, bobbing his head so delicately that some of the brown paper concluded to fly off at once. "And he said it the next time," ran on Polly, "and the next. But when he came around again, he rubbed his eyes and tried to stop, but his feet wouldn't let him, so on he had to go." "Oh dear," said Percy and Van. "Couldn't he really stop, Polly?" "No," said Polly, "he couldn't really, but around the mug he must keep going. And the time after, when he came to the front once more, it was all he could do to keep from bursting into tears. And at last he screamed right out, 'Oh dear lovely lady, where have you gone?'" "Why, she was in the mug," said Van, tumbling off the sofa corner in a great state of excitement. "Do tell him that, Polly," coming up to her chair. "Keep still," said Ben, holding up a warning finger. "But he couldn't stop, for you see, his feet won't let him," said Polly, and he began to cry dreadfully big tears all over his fine blue coat and his good head. And every time before he reached the front of the mug, he watched between his sobs to see if she got back. And when he found out she hadn't, he screamed worse than ever, "Oh dear, sweet, lovely lady, where have you gone?" "I don't think she was very nice," said Percy. "She might have said something." "And there she was, all huddled up in the bottom of the mug," said Polly, "crying so hard she could scarcely breathe. And she tried to call to him, 'Oh dear, beautiful little man, do come and help me out.' But her voice didn't reach anywhere, for it was such a wee little squeal. So on he had to go around and around, and she kept on shaking and trembling down in the very bottom of the mug. The little bunch of Peppers and Jasper preserving a smiling content, knowing well what was to become of the lovely lady and the beautiful little man, since Polly had told them more than once in the little brown house. "Do hurry and tell them," whispered Ben in her ear, so Polly laughed and hastened on. "I'll help you," said a voice close by on the shelf. The lovely lady bobbing away in the bottom of the mug, and the beautiful little man crying his eyes out as he walked around and around the china mug, stopped weeping and screaming to listen with all his ears. "I'm Sir Bow Wow," declared the voice, which came out, you must know, of Phronsie's crockery dog that the lady in the centre of Badger Town gave her, when she was a baby, to cut her teeth on. Phronsie used to put his head in her mouth and bite hard, and that made her teeth come through quicker. Well, he was brown and ugly, and 1 year was gone, because she had dropped him a good many times. Oh, and 2 or 3 of his toes were broken off. But he was a great help now in this dreadful trouble that had overtaken the lovely lady and the beautiful little man, because he had a good head to think out things. "I'm so glad Phronsie didn't bite it off," said Van with a sigh of relief. "Well, go on," said Presley briefly. Sir Bow Wow cleared his throat. Then he asked sharply, "Are you sure you won't ever say such dreadful things as I heard from you, ever again in all this world?" "Oh, quite sure," said the lovely lady, heaving a long sigh. "If you only get me out of such a small place, Sir Bow Wow, I will be just as good as I can be. And if you will only bring back the lovely lady, I will be just as good as I can be," said the beautiful little man. "Sir Bow Wow, I promise you." And they couldn't hear each other, only what the brown crooked dog said. And he asked again, "Are you sure you won't turn your backs on each other, but you'll bow and courtesy as prettily as you always used to?" And they both promised him most solemnly that they would do that very thing, if he would only help them now out of this dreadful trouble. So the brown crockery dog jumped up to the top of the funny handle of the china mug and sat there and scratched his head gravely, and thought, while the beautiful little man walked twice around the china mug. "The very thing," at last exclaimed Sir Bow Wow. "Now then, hurry, lovely lady," as he put one of his paws over the edge of the mug, and then peeped over. "Can't you reach up?" he asked. But the lovely lady down in the bottom of the china mug, although she stood on all her tiptoes, couldn't so much as touch the end of his paw. She said in a faint voice, huddling down in a miserable little heap and beginning to weep again. "Nonsense!" cried Sir Bow Wow, although he was terribly afraid that she would. "I'll think again." So he scratched his head once more and thought, while the beautiful little man walked twice around the china mug. "This time I have it," declared the brown crooked dog, and he put his paw over the edge of the mug. "Twine the roses in the basket on your arm into a vine, and I'll throw up one end over my paw and I'll put you up." And the lovely lady stopped crying and began to laugh, all the while she set to work busily making a vine out of the roses in the basket hanging on her arm. And she twisted the thorns and leaves all in and out so nicely that before long she had a streaming garland, and she threw up one end of it over the paw of Sir Bow Wow, just as he had told her to do, and, in a minute, there she was standing on the edge of the china mug, up by the funny twisted handle. "That's fine," cried Sir Bow Wow, so greatly pleased that he wanted to bark. But he didn't dare for fear of scaring the beautiful little man, who was now approaching the funny twisted handle. "Hurry and hop down, O lovely lady, and run to your place, for here he comes." So the lovely lady hopped down and hurried with all her might to her old place in the front of the china mug, crowding her rose garland into the basket hanging on her arm, and she went along. And she had just got there, and she picked up her gown to make a little courtesy, when the beautiful little man came up and stood quite still. "I'll make you a bow all the rest of my life," said he, bowing away as fast as he could. "And I will courtesy to you as long as I live," she said, dropping him a most beautiful one. And so, as there was nothing else to do, Sir Bow Wow ran to his end of the shelf and stood up in as stiff as ever. "And that's the way we found them all in the next morning when we got up and went into the kitchen," said Polly. End of story 23.
Story 24 of the stories Polly Pepper told. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Craig Franklin. The stories Polly Pepper told to the 5 little Peppers in the Little Brown House by Margaret SIDNEY. Brown Betty. Mrs. Whitney sat in her room, her soft hair floating over her dressing gown, with little Dick in her arms, just as he had run wailing with his story of distress.
"My throat isn't sore,"
he screamed between his tears,
"and I want to go out with the other boys."
Polly, running along the hall, with a new book that Jasper had loaned her tucked under her arm, a happy half-hour dancing before her eyes, heard him, and stopped suddenly. Then she turned back, and put her brown head in the doorway. "Oh dear!" and she came close to Miss Whitney's chair.
"I'm not sick, and I want to go out with the boys,"
roared Dick, worse than ever.
"I want to go out! I want to go out!"
"I suppose that's just what Brown Betty cried," said Polly, saying the first thing that popped into her head of all the stories she used to tell in the Little Brown House.
"Eh?"
Little Dick lifted his head from the nest where he had burrowed under his mother's soft hair, and regarded her closely through his tears. Polly knelt down by Mrs. Whitney's side and turned her back on Jasper's new book, where she laid it on the floor. "You don't know how Brown Betty wanted to get out," she said, "but she couldn't do it, not a bit of it." "Why not?" demanded Dick suddenly, and edging along on his mother's lap to look into Polly's eyes. "Why couldn't she get out, Polly?" "Why, because she fell in," said Polly, shaking her brown head sadly, "and there was no one to help her out, no matter how much she cried. So she made up her mind not to cry at all." "Didn't she cry a teensy wee bit?" asked little Dick, trying to wipe away the drops on his cheek with his chubby hand. "Not a single bit of a tear," said Polly decidedly. "What was the use? It wouldn't help her to get out. You see, it was just this way. She was hurrying down the garden path just as fast as her feet could carry her, and she had a big bundle in her mouth." "In her mouth?" repeated little Dick in astonishment, and slipping from his mother's lap, he cuddled on the floor beside Polly and folded his small hands. "Yes, in her mouth," said Polly merrily. "Oh, didn't I tell you? Brown Betty was a dear little bug, just as brown as could be. And the bundle in her mouth was a piece of a dead fly she was taking home for a children's dinner." "Oh," said Dick. "Tell me, Polly." Mrs. Whitney slipped out of her chair to finish her dressing, first pausing to pat Polly's brown hair. "So you see, poor Brown Betty couldn't look very well where she was going, for the piece of a dead fly stuck out in front of her eyes so far that the first thing she knew, down she went, down, 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 and she never stopped till she stood in the midst of hundreds and hundreds of black creatures." "Oh, Polly!" exclaimed little Dick in dismay. "Yes," said Polly, "and there she was, and she couldn't speak for a minute, for she had come so far and so fast that it was impossible for her to catch her breath. So the black creatures ran around and around her in great glee, and every one of them said, 'How very nice and fat you are! Now we'll eat you all up.'" "Oh, Polly!" cried little Dick again, and snuggling up close, "didn't she cry then?" "No," said Polly, "she didn't, because you see it wouldn't have done her any good. She'd got to think up things, how to get out and all that, you know, so there wasn't any time to cry, and she spoke up just as soon as she could catch her breath. 'Oh, what a wonderful place this is!' and she rolled her little bits of eyes all round, and the ants said—" "Oh, with hundreds of black creatures ants?" asked little Dick. "Yes, indeed. Oh, didn't I tell you?" cried Polly, all in one breath. "They were dear little black ants, and the deep, deep place that Brown Betty tumbled into when she was carrying home the piece of dead fly was their house. And when she said, 'Oh, what a wonderful place is this!' they were all very much pleased, and they ran around and around her faster than ever, all talking together, and they said, 'She seems to be very wise. It's a pity to eat her just now. We will wait and let her tell us things first.' And Brown Betty heard them say that as they were all running around her and around her. For you see, when she made up her mind not to cry, she thought she would better keep her ears open as well as her eyes, and find out some way to escape." "What's escape?" interrupted little Dick. "Oh, to get out, so they wouldn't eat her," said Polly. "Well, and so when she heard them say that, why, Brown Betty thought of something else that would give her more time to think up things, how to get away, and she said, 'Oh, if I might only see some of the splendid places you've got in your house, I should be so happy.' For you see, she had heard how the ants built great long halls and rooms, and ever so many nooks and crannies. And the big ant that made them all mind everything she said heard her say it, because Brown Betty called it as loud as she could, and so the big ant spoke up and ordered a company of 100 ants to get into line." "Oh, Polly, 100 ants!" cried little Dick with an absorbed face. "Yes, indeed, that's nothing," said Polly. "Sometimes they had 1,000 march off somewhere, wherever the big Queen Ant would tell them to go. Well, these 100 ran right around Brown Betty and got her in the middle. 'Now go and show her the long corridor,' said the big mother ant." "You said she was the Queen Ant," corrected Dick. "Yes, so she was, and the mother ant too," said Polly, "but I like that best, so I'm going to call her so." "Well, Polly," said Dick hastily, "I very much wish you'd call her Captain Ant." "Well, I will," said Polly, bursting into a merry laugh. That made Mrs. Whitney smile too, a smile that went right down into Polly's heart and made her forget all about Jasper's new book lying there on the floor. Now she's Captain Ant. We mustn't forget that, Dick."
"We mustn't forget that," repeated Dick in great satisfaction. "Now go on, Polly, do."
So the company of 100 ants went off just as Captain Ant had told them, to show Brown Betty the long corridor.
"What's a long what is that word, Polly?"
"Corridor. Oh, that's a great long hall, ever and ever so long," said Polly.
"And it was broad and splendid, and the walls were so smooth as a board, and the top was just as smooth too, and out of it ran different rooms and nooks and crannies and funny little places. So when Brown Betty heard Captain Ant command them to show her the long corridor, she began to set her busy little head to thinking that perhaps she might steal away from them, hide somewhere in one of those queer little spots." "And did she?" cried little Dick eagerly.
"Oh, I can't tell you now," said Polly. "Wait and see. Well, off they went down the long corridor with the smooth dirt walls, and—"
"You said it was a board," corrected little Dick.
"Oh, no, Dickie," said Polly. "I said it was as smooth as a board. But they were all made of dirt walls, and everything was all polished off by the ants till it was straight and high and splendid. Well, off they went."
"What a perfectly remarkable place!" cried Brown Betty, rolling up her little bits of eyes at everything as they marched her along in the middle, which pleased them very much. So they let her drop behind the procession once in a while to admire something or other. "Oh, now is she going to run away? I know," said Dick in great excitement.
"Oh, she can't get away yet," said Polly. "You wait and see, Dickie." Just then, while she was hanging back from the rest of the company, for they were all talking together as they ran around and around, and saying how extremely wise she was, and what a pity it was that they had got to eat her up, after they had shown her all about, she heard a little noise. You see, she was peering into a little cranny.
"What's a cranny?"
asked Dick abruptly. "Oh, a little hideaway place in the wall," said Polly. "Well, she was peering in there, and wondering if she could slip in, when the 100 ants weren't looking, when she heard this little noise."
"What was it?"
asked Dick, getting as close to Polly as he could. "You'll see. And then as she peered in, she saw another brown bug, just like herself, only bigger, chained to the side of the wall so she couldn't get away."
"Oh, dear me!" exclaimed Dick. "How big was the chain?"
"Oh, it wasn't big at all," said Polly. "How could it be to fasten up that wee brown bug? It was all made of the hairs of the black spiders dropped in the garden, where the ant house was, and the ants had twisted them together and made chains to tie up their prisoners with."
"Oh!"
said Dickie, drawing a long breath.
"And she was tied up tight?"
"Oh, just as tight," said Polly. "The chains went all around her legs and over her neck, and there she was sobbing away as if her heart would break."
"What made her cry?" asked Dick. "Why didn't she think up things how to get away, just like your brown bug, Polly?"
And he drew himself up with the determination to be like Brown Betty. "Well, you see, she didn't," said Polly. "That's just the difference. So there she was, chained to the wall of that cranny." "They are waiting till I get fat enough," said this poor creature to Brown Betty. "Then they'll eat me. I heard them say so." Now Brown Betty couldn't act as if she'd heard anything, you know, for all those 100 ants would pounce on them both and cut their heads off, maybe. So she said, "Hush, and I'll try and save you." Then she hurried off to the company. "Now show me something more wonderful yet," she said.
"We'll show her the Hall of Justice," said the ants one to another. "What is that, Polly?" asked little Dick.
"Oh, you'll see. The ants are going to tell Brown Betty all about it. Then you'll know." Well, so off they went. And by this time they thought so much of Brown Betty's wisdom, for they were all talking of it together, that they got very careless about keeping her in the middle. But they let her wander at the end of the procession, and stop when she wanted to admire everything very much.
"Oh, now I know that she's going to run away!" exclaimed little Dick, striking his hands together in great delight.
And at last there they stood, in the middle of the great Hall of Justice. Brown Betty just blinked her eyes. She was so afraid she should cry, when the ants all screamed out together,
"We try our prisoners here before we eat them up."
But she pretended she didn't care, and she said, "What's that big chair up there?" pointing to the end of the room.
"That's not a chair," said the ants all together. "That is the throne."
"What is a throne?" asked Brown Betty, to gain time to think out things by keeping them talking. Besides, she was trembling so with fright that her poor little knees
knocked together, and she had to say something, or she would have dropped in a dead faint. "Oh, so wise a creature not to know what a throne is!" exclaimed all the ants together in astonishment, and they ran around and around worse than ever, till poor Brown Betty's head spun to see them go. They made her so giddy. "It's where the Queen Ant sits too." "You said you'd call her Captain Ant," broke in Dick. "Oh, yes, I did. Well, Captain Ant," corrected Polly. "Well, it's where the captain sits," said all the ants together, still running around and around to try the prisoners. "Oh," said Brown Betty, her poor knees knocking together worse than ever. Then she managed to pick up courage to ask the first thing that came into her head. "How does she try them?" One of the 100 ants ran out from the company and close up to Brown Betty. "She is so wise," he said to himself. "I want to show her that I am wise too." So he hurried up to her side. "Do you see the sword hanging up there?" he whispered. And the other 99 ants were all talking together and running about, so they didn't hear him. "Where?" asked Brown Betty, peering up above the throne. "I see nothing." "Of course," said the ant, who wanted to show how wise he was, and he laughed softly. He was so pleased that he could tell her something new. "You can't see it till I tell you where it is, so I am wiser than you. Well, when the Queen has that in her hand, she can do anything she pleases. It all comes to pass. It hangs just back of the throne at the top. Now don't you think I'm wise?" Brown Betty's heart gave a great jump. "Oh, sir," she cried, "what a wonderful creature you are!" which so delighted the ant that he ran around and around her 60 times without stopping, talking to himself all the way. "She says I'm a wonderful creature." All this time Brown Betty was thinking how she could get up into that throne, and presently she said as loud as she could, "One of the most wonderful places that ever I was in is this very spot, but I must sit on the throne before I can say it is the most wonderful place," she added boldly, while her poor knees shook and knocked so together she thought she should die. "She must say it is the most wonderful place she was ever in," declared the company of ants in consternation, "else Captain Ant will have our heads off when we carry her back." And they ran around and around her worse than ever, saying this over all the time. At last they all stopped and swarmed around her, keeping her in the middle. "Will you say this is the most wonderful place I was ever in, if we let you up on the throne?" they cried at her. "I will," promised Brown Betty as quickly as a flash. So they opened their ranks, and before she could think twice, there she was up in the throne, and looking down into their faces. But how to get hold of the sword she didn't know. "Oh, Polly, do let her get the sword," cried little Dick in great distress. "Please show her how. Please hurry, Polly, and show her how quick." And there she was, looking down into their faces, and she knew she must hurry and say the word she had promised, and then get down, and she was at her wits' end to know what to do. "Please hurry and show her how quick," begged little Dick, his knees knocking together. "What a wonderful top to that throne!" cried Brown Betty. "I must see that first." And as quickly as she said the words, up she ran with all her speed to the very tip of the throne spread over her head. The wise ant, who had told her of the sword, just then screamed out, "Hold her back!" But it was too late. Brown Betty's little bits of eyes were keen and sharp. There was the sword hanging before her, and in a second it was in her mouth, and she was waving it over the 100 ants. "Stop where you are," she screamed at them, "or I'll cut your heads off," and not a single ant moved. "She killed them all! She killed them!" piped Dickie in the most joyful tone, and springing to his feet he danced all over the dressing room, singing, "Brown Betty killed them all." "Oh, no, she didn't," said Polly, as soon as she could make herself heard. "She didn't kill them!" exclaimed little Dick, coming to a dead stop in amazement. "Oh, no, of course not," said Polly. "Brown Betty wouldn't do such a cruel thing, if she could get away and help the other brown bug off without hurting them. She just slipped down from the throne, waving her sword at them and telling them that she would cut their heads off if they stirred, but they couldn't, you know. Then she slammed the door of the Hall of Justice tight too and locked them all in. "That was worse," said Dickie, coming up quite close to her. "Oh, some of the other ants would come by and by to look for them," said Polly comfortingly, "and let them out. So down the little corridor she ran with Captain's sword in her mouth till she reached the cranny where the other brown bug was tied. "'Stop crying,' she commanded, and with one flash of the sword she snipped the chain everywhere it was fastened. 'Now come on,' and she dragged the prisoner out, and away they went, Brown Betty waving the sword high, for she didn't know when she would meet any ants, and she must be ready to keep them off. 'You've been longer here than I,' she cried to the other brown bug, 'so don't you know some way out?' 'Let me stop and think,' begged the other brown bug. 'You hurry me so I can't think of anything.' So Brown Betty pulled her into a little cubbyhole they were racing by in the corridor, while she stood on guard, still waving the captain's sword. 'I will give you till I count to 10, she said. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Oh dear, groaned little Dick. 9, 10. 'Straight ahead, turn to your right,' screamed the other brown bug, and out into the long corridor they stepped once more, and ran like lightning. And then, after a while, 'Turn,' she said. 'I heard them say that they had built a secret way, and there was a little narrow slit of a way down which they turned, and they turned, and they turned, till finally, after they had got through turning, all of a sudden out it came into the green grass. And don't you think, right round the door, only they didn't see it, it was so covered with a clump of leaves, were 6 little, wee, tiny brown bugs, all crying and screaming and rubbing their eyes for their mummy, and there she was, right in their midst. 'Oh, Polly, was it Brown Betty's home she got to?' screamed little Dick, throwing his arms around her, his cheeks aflame. 'Yes,' said Polly, 'it truly was, and Brown Betty would never have found it at all if she hadn't gone back to save the other brown bug.' 'And what did she do with the captain's sword?' at last asked Dickie, coming out of his entrancement. 'I don't know,' said Polly. 'But here come the boys, Dickie.'"
End of story 24. Recording by Craig Franklin.
Story 25 of the stories Polly Pepper told. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tim Watkins. The stories Polly Pepper told to the 5 little peppers in the little brown house by Margaret SIDNEY. The silly little Brook. "Please, Polly," entreated Phronsie, pulling Polly's gown gently. "Oh, pet, there isn't time," said Polly hastily, "to tell you a story now. Why, Mamsie will call us in a quarter of an hour." "Just the silly little Brook," pleaded Phronsie, folding her hands. "Why, you've heard that 50,000 times," said Polly. Oh, don't ask for that." She gave a long yawn and flew back to the table. "Where's that pink embroidery silk Auntie gave me? Now I'll try that new stitch." "Here, 'tis," said Phronsie, getting down on the floor and spying it where it had trailed off on the tablecloth, and she quickly brought it up in her hand. "Oh, that's good," exclaimed Polly in great satisfaction, with one eye on the French mantel clock. "Now, if I had to hunt for that tiresome pink silk, the whole quarter of an hour would be gone, and I must try this rosebud to show to Auntie Whitney." She seized her embroidery work, huddling up silks and thimble and all, and ran to ensconce herself in a cozy corner of the library sofa, humming softly to herself the last piece of music Monsieur had given to her. "I might have a piece of the silly little Brook," said Phronsie, standing quite still by the table. "What is it?" cried Polly, coming out from the trills and runs to stare at her. "Oh, that story. I forgot all about it, Phronsie. Yes, indeed, you shall have it." And a remorseful wave made her cheeks rosy red. "I'm a selfish little pig, Phronsie. Come over, and I'll tell it right away." "You're not a little pig," said Phronsie, hurrying over to the sofa to tuck herself away in a blissful frame of mind close to Polly. "And I'm so glad you are going to tell it, and please begin right off, Polly," all in one breath. "Yes, indeed I will," said Polly, with a sorry little twinge for the minutes lost. "Well, you know the silly little brook was not our cherry brook," she began, well knowing that fact must usher in the story. "It was not our cherry brook," repeated Phronsie distinctly, and smoothing down her white apron, "because our cherry brook was a nice brook and didn't do silly things." "That's so," assented Polly, wondering if she was making her rosebud pink enough. "Well, one day, quite early in the morning, when the sun was peeking over the top of a high mountain—" "Tell how he peeked over, please, Polly," begged Phronsie, who dearly loved to have Polly act out her stories. So Polly laid down her rosebud, thimble and all, in Phronsie's lap, and got up and told it over again to Phronsie's intense satisfaction. Then she hopped back to her embroidery work. And at the same time the silly little brook awoke and opened its eyes to the sun and the world. "Oh, how do you do?" said the sun, laughing as the silly little brook blinked its eyes at him. "Who are you?" asked the silly little brook. "I never saw you before." "Of course not," said the sun, laughing worse than ever, "because you have never been awake before. Come now, it is time for you to get to work. You've been a long time asleep. Look back of you." The silly little brook did just as the sun told her, and looked back of her. "I don't see anything," she said, "except a black hole in the ground." "Of course you don't," said the sun, "because that's all there is to see. You just come out of that hole where you've been asleep all your life. Now look ahead." The sun said this so loud and stared at her face so long that the silly little brook began to feel quite uncomfortable. So she winked and blinked and said nothing. "Look ahead," commanded the sun sharply. "Oh, you silly, stupid little thing." And this time she obeyed, and there was a tiny, wee little stream of clear white water trickling away like a thread down the mountain. "It was the silly little brook," cried Phronsie, clapping her hands in glee, just as if she hadn't heard the story time and again. "Yes," said Polly, bobbing her head and setting in quick stitches, "so it was." "Now hurry up," said the sun. By this time he was very fierce, for his face had been getting rounder and bigger every minute. "And set to work, for you have a great deal to do. Be a useful little brook, and don't stop on your way, and I shall be glad that you woke up. Good day." And the silly little brook felt her feet give way before her, and in a minute she was slipping and sliding down the mountainside. "I'm not going to be sent down in this fashion," she grumbled, as soon as she could catch her breath, while she rested a bit in a hollow. "I shall choose my way, and what I'll do, and I'm not going to work all the time either, and that cross old sun needn't think he can command me to do it. I'm going to play as much as I want to." With that she rested in the hollow all that day, and the next, and the next. Phronsie shook her yellow head mournfully, as one who knows a sorrowful tale too well. "The first day," said Polly, hurrying up, "the birds came to see the silly little brook, and they sang sweet songs over her head, and they told her pretty stories, and they dipped their beaks in her clear little pool of water in the hollow. And the silly little brook said to herself, 'Oh, what a lovely time this is. How good it was for me that I didn't mind what the cross old sun said to me when he told me not to stop. Forsooth, I shall stop here as long as I want to.'" "What is it, Polly, mean?" asked Phronsie, who always asked this question at this particular stage of the story. "Oh, it doesn't mean anything," said Polly carelessly. "Then why did she say it?" persisted Phronsie. "Oh, because it sounded nice," said Polly, twitching her pink silk thread out to replace it with a green one to begin on the calyx. "People have to say things sometimes that don't mean anything in a story." "Do they?" said Phronsie with wandering eyes. "Well, she did anyway," said Polly. "So she said, 'forsooth,' and tossed her head, and immediately she felt very big and grand. And the next day the birds came, and everything was lovely, and the silly little brook went to sleep at night, and dreamed of all sorts of beautiful things. But the day after she looked up and saw to her astonishment a flock of birds that was whirring around over the tip of the mountainside, paused when they got to her, and looked down. Then they whispered together, and presently off they flew, chattering, 'Oh, no, no, we'll not stop there.'" What to make of it the silly little brook did not know. She only tossed her head and grew angrier and angrier, and said she didn't care. But she went to sleep sobbing as hard as she could that night, and her pillow, a clump of moss, was wet with tears. Phronsie moved uneasily, but said not a word. At last, as morning broke, the silly little brook heard a voice close to her ear say, "Oh, dear brook, wake up. I have something to say to you." And there was Robin Redbreast. "I'm so glad he has come, Polly," ejaculated Phronsie in relief. The silly little brook at that opened her eyes. "What is it?" she asked sadly. "Don't you know why the birds are flying over your head to seek other streams without so much as giving you a gentle word, and no one remains to tell you the truth but me?" asked Robin. "No, I don't," said the silly little brook. "Tell me, Robin." "Look for yourself," said Robin Redbreast. So the silly little brook turned her eyes to look at herself in the little hollow where she had rested, and lo and behold, instead of the clear white water with the shade, just like the violets in our woods at Badgertown, you know, Phronsie? And Polly's hands with her work dropped to her lap. "Why?" Yes, I know," said Phronsie with a small sigh, hearing which Polly picked up her work again and hurried on. "Why, there was a dark, dirty pool of water with a little green scum coming all over the top of it." "Oh, Horace!" screamed the silly little brook. "Why, where have I gone? That isn't my brook." "Yes, it is," said Robin, shaking his head sadly. "You're turned into this hateful thing because you stayed still. Oh, dear brook, why didn't you obey the good sun and go on?" "I will now," said the silly little brook, bursting into a torrent of tears, and she tried to start, but her feet were all tangled up in a mess of leaves and green things that weren't nice, and she couldn't stir a step. Phronsie here moved uneasily again, but waited for Polly to go on. "I'll help you," said Robin Redbreast quickly, and jumping down he picked patiently all the sticks and leaves he could in his bill, and carried them out of the way of the silly little brook when she should once more start to run down the mountainside. "He was a nice Robin Redbreast, Polly, and I like him," Phronsie exclaimed joyfully. "So he was, pet," Polly made haste to answer. "Well, but as fast as he picked off the leaves and sticks out of the way of the silly little brook, ever so many others would come blowing down on her from the trees and choke up the path again. So at last poor Robin Redbreast had to sit down quite tired out, and declare he could do no more." "Please hurry and tell it, Polly," begged Phronsie, pulling her sleeve, for Polly dearly loved to stop a bit in the most impressive spots. "Well, and then the silly little brook began to sob and to scream louder than ever, and the sticks and leaves flew around her thick and fast, for it was a very windy day, and the birds flew over her head, never so much as giving her a glance, and it was very dreadful indeed," said Polly, holding up her embroidery at arm's length to see if the calyx was beginning to look exactly as if the rosebud were just picked from the garden. "Please hurry," begged Phronsie, pulling her sleeve again. "So I will," said Polly. "I think it's just as near right as I can get it, although it doesn't look like a real rose," she sighed. but you must let me stop once in a while, child, for the story sounds better." "But I want the silly little Brook to stop crying and get out," said Phronsie in gentle haste. "Well, so I will let her out. You'll see," promised Polly, hurrying on to set in more green stitches, determined, since she couldn't make it like a real rose from Grandpapa's garden, she would have it as good a one as possible. "I shall die here," mourned the silly little Brook, and the wind in the trees sobbed over her. "She will die there," until Robin Redbreast let his head droop on his pretty red bosom. "Please hurry, Polly," said Phronsie pleadingly, and there were tears in the brown eyes. But suddenly up jumped Robin, cried Polly, casting aside her embroidery on the sofa and suiting the action to the word. She sprang to her feet and waved her arms, and he trilled out loud and clear while he flapped his wings. "Stop your crying, dear Brook. I will go and bring some help." For he had heard what the silly little Brook had not been able to hear, as she was weeping so hard, the notes way up in the sky of some little birds that he knew. "Polly!" exclaimed Phronsie in great excitement, and slipping from the sofa to plant herself in front of Polly, still waving her arms and crying, "Stop your crying, dear Brook. I will go and bring some help. I love that Robin Redbreast, I do." "Well, we must get back to the sofa and finish this story, or Mamsie'll call us before we're ready," laughed Polly, her arms tumbling to her sides, and she picked up Phronsie, and in a minute there they were in the cozy corner once more. So off he flew post-haste, hurried on Polly, picking up her needle once more to set quick stitches, and oh, as soon as you could think, back he came, and a whole troop of Robin Redbreasts who were on a journey together, and there were so many of them that they picked out every stick and leaf before the new ones had a chance to choke up the way, and pretty soon, "Start now," they said, and the silly little Brook put out her feet, and away she went, slipping and sliding, and trickling and running like a mad little thing down the mountainside. Phronsie clapped her hands and shouted in glee. "Don't stop again," screamed every one of those Robin Redbreast after her, "but go on, and on, and on." "Polly," called Mamsie over the stairs, and "Phronsie, it's time to go downtown to buy your shoes." End of story 25. Recording by Tim Watkins.
Story 26 of The Stories Polly Pepper Told. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Angela. The Stories Polly Pepper Told to the Five Little Peppers in the Little Brown House by Margaret SIDNEY. Down in the Orchard. "It was such a comfort to have an orchard," said Polly, clasping her hands in delight at the remembrance. "You can't think, and we used to have such fun out there when the work was done up." "How many trees were there?" asked Percy with an eye for details. "Oh, there weren't any trees," said Polly quickly. "There was just one, but we played there were ever and ever so many, so we called it an orchard." "Oh, dear me!" exclaimed Percy and Van together. "It was an apple tree," said Joel, "and there weren't any apples on it either, only we used to play there were." "Oh, Joel!" exclaimed Polly, "have you forgotten? Don't you remember one year that we got some?" "Mean old things," declared Joel, "and so hard they'd almost break your teeth." "Well, you and Dave managed to eat them," said Ben, laughing. "Because we couldn't get any others," said Joel, "and they were only about a dozen of them, I guess." "That was better than nothing," said Polly. "Well, you see, we did have apples on the trees sometimes, so we could call it an orchard, and when we had our work done, we could go out there and play, and Phronsie could always take Seraphina and stay there ever so long, because it was just a little way back of the kitchen door, so you see we thought a great deal indeed of our orchard." "Tell us what you used to do out in your orchard," begged Van abruptly, "every single thing." "Oh, dear me," said Polly, drawing a long breath at the delightful remembrances. "I can't tell you all the things we used to do there any more than I can about all the good times we had in the dear old kitchen." "There's no use in asking the Peppers to tell all the good times they had in the little brown house," declared Jasper with kindling eyes, "because you see they just can't do it. I know, because I've been there." "Jappy always feels so smart because he's been at the little brown house," exclaimed Van enviously. "Well, why shouldn't I?" retorted Jasper gaily. "It's something to feel smart over, I can tell you, to go to the little brown house." "I wish we could ever go there," said Percy wishfully. "Well, if you want to hear Polly tell of what we did down in our orchard, you would better stop talking and let her begin," advised Ben. "I think so too," laughed Jasper. "I'm as bad as the rest, but when it comes to talking about the little brown house, why, I just forget and pitch in. Now do go on, Polly, we beg your pardon." And he shook his head at the other boys. "Yes, we do beg your pardon," Percy and Van made haste to say, seeing that Jasper had said it first. "All right," said Polly. "Then I'll begin straight off to tell you of one nice time we had down in our orchard. You see, Mamsie was off at the minister's house, helping to make over the parlor carpet, and we really hadn't any work to do. And for a wonder, Ben was home because there was no wood for him to chop anywhere, and it was a long, hot summer afternoon. First, we thought we'd go off to the woods, and why didn't you?" broke in Van, with wide eyes for the indifference to the charms of the woods. "Hush," said Jasper, holding up his hand. Percy was just going to say, "I should think you'd have gone to the woods and dug up moss and flowers and cunning little roots." But hearing Jasper's "hush," he ducked involuntarily, very glad he hadn't spoken. "Oh, Phronsie wasn't very well," said Polly. "That is, she hadn't been, and we knew Mamsie wouldn't want her to walk so far. And besides, it was just as much fun to play in our orchard, so we all decided to go there. Well, off we started." "Why, I thought you said it was just a little way back of the kitchen door," said Percy, surprised out of himself. "So it was," answered Polly, "but we played it was ever so far off, and we walked around and around the little brown house, all but Phronsie. She sat on the back steps till we were ready to go into the orchard. Then she got down, and we all went in together," said Polly, with a grand flourish as if escorting her auditors into enchanted space, big beyond description. "Well, and don't you think there was the greatest surprise when we got there?" "Oh, tell us!" begged all the Whitney boys impatiently. "Why, Ben had run off after we had talked over whether we would go to the woods or not, and we didn't think we ought to, for Mamsie wouldn't like to have Phronsie walk so far, and he had brought back some flowers and some moss and ever so many things." "That's nice," said Percy in a satisfied way. "And there they were on the little stone table," said Polly. "Oh, did you have a stone table in your orchard?" asked Van. "Yes, I've seen it ever so many times," said Jasper. Then he pulled himself up, laughing. "Beg pardon, Polly." "Ho, ho, you're talking!" cried Van at him. "Can't help it," said Jasper recklessly. "When you begin to ask about the good times in the little brown house, I must talk." "You see," said Polly to the Whitney boys, "we had to have a table for our tea parties and ever so many other things, and so Ben chose a big stone in a field. It was Deacon Brown's meadow, and he—" "You said it was a field, Polly Pepper," interrupted Percy in his most literal way. "Well, it was just about the same thing," said Polly, laughing. "Never mind him, Polly," said Jasper, "and you never will get this story if you keep stopping her all the time," from Ben. So Polly hurried on. "And Deacon Brown was just as glad as he could be, of course, to have that big stone carried off from his meadow." "Why?" asked Van. "I should think all the Brown children would have wanted to play on it." "Oh, there are such oceans of stones in Badgertown," cried Polly, lifting her hands. "Oh, Polly!" exclaimed Ben. "Oceans of stones?" "Well, I mean such a very, very great many," said Polly, with the color flooding her face. "You can't think, boys, and they bother the farmers dreadfully when they want to cut their grass. The poor cows have such hard work to get their noses in between them, the stones I mean, in order to get anything to eat." "The farmers almost have to whittle off the cows' noses for them to get a bite," said Ben. "And Joel and David would pick rocks for the farmers sometimes," said Polly, "but that was nice because—" "Mean old work," said Joel, stretching himself. "Picking rocks. Didn't our backs ache, Dave?" Little David twisted uneasily in his chair, unwilling to say how very unpleasant he had found the task of picking rocks, and wishing that the question had not been asked. "Well," said Polly brightly, "it was nice when the boys brought home the fresh vegetables that the farmers would give them for picking those rocks. You ought to have seen Mamsie's face then." Joel straightened up at that and forgot all about his aching back, and little David was very glad he hadn't been obliged to say anything. "So now you see," ran on Polly, "how very glad Deacon Brown was to give Ben the big stone for our orchard table. So Ben tugged and tugged and we helped, Dave and I did," shouted Joel. "Didn't we, Ben?" "Yes, indeed," said Ben heartily. "You did, both of you. I don't believe I could ever have brought the great thing down to the orchard without you." Thereupon Joel felt very big and tall, and little David sat up as high in his chair as possible. "Oh, it was a perfectly splendid table," exclaimed Polly. "You can't think how fine it was when it was all set up under our apple tree. It was most flat on top, and it was as high as this, and as big as this," and she put out her hands and began to measure it all off briskly. "Ho, that isn't near big enough," cried Joel, springing to her side. "'Twas as big as this," and he executed the most remarkable series of curves, spreading his arms to the infinite discomfort of everyone in his neighborhood. "See here," called Ben at him, amidst the general laugh at Joel's table. If you go on knocking off all our heads in this fashion, we'll put you out this second. Yes, sir. The idea of such a stone as that! Why, it would have taken a pair of horses and a cart to bring it, let alone our digging it up. Oh, Joe." "I don't care," said Joel sturdily. "It was as big as that, anyway," bringing his arms in with a sudden swoop. "Well now, Joe," said Jasper, "if you don't keep quiet, we shan't get any further in this story than that table," which had the effect of sending Joel into his seat as quickly as he had jumped off. And Polly began again before he had a chance to speak. "And there on the top of the table was a big bunch of flowers. We had a teacup that Mamsie had given us because it was cracked and the handle was gone, and Ben had put some of the flowers he brought from the woods into it, but the rest he made up into little bunches and laid one on every little stone seat, for I forgot to tell you, the boys had brought 5 little stones, one for each of us, so we could always have our chairs ready for us, you know." "Oh, dear me," sighed little Dick, quite overcome with longing. "How I do wish we could have little stone seats." "And a stone table," added Van enviously. "And a whole orchard," finished Percy, "just like the Peppers." Meantime, Polly was hurrying on. "Well, when we saw all those lovely things that Ben had done, Phronsie spied them first. We just danced around him and we held our hands together tight so he couldn't get out of the ring, and we all curtsied and bowed and thanked him as much as we could." "I should think you did," said Ben, laughing. "Then we made him take the best seat in honor of it all," went on Polly. "And Polly made a speech of thanks," said Joel. "It was prime, and Ben said, 'Much obliged for the speech.'" "And then we set about giving our play," said Polly quickly. "Our what?" asked the Whitneys. "Why, our play," said Polly. "Didn't you know that was what we were going to do that hot afternoon when we decided to go out in the orchard? Well, I must tell you, we were going to act a little play." Oh, how fine!" exclaimed Percy and Van, while Ben cried, "It was Polly's play. She thought it all out." "Well, they helped act it," said Polly, "and that was best." "Do go on," begged the Whitney boys, and this time Jasper said too, "Do go on, Polly." "Well, the play was The Little White Rabbit and Mr. Fox." Oh, exclaimed the Whitneys, while Jasper smiled approval. "Yes, Phronsie was to be the White Rabbit, you see. We'd got an old white bedspread Mamsie let us take for our plays, and we tied up 2 ends so they stuck up high, and those made the ears, and when she was in it, and the paws all puckered up, she looked very nice, and I was the White Rabbit, Jasper," said Polly gravely, turning to him. "I know, Pet," he said, smiling at her, "so you were, to be sure," as Polly hurried on. "Well, Ben was Mr. Fox, and he did look so funny," cried Polly, bursting into a laugh, in which Joel and David joined in the remembrance. "You see, he had a big piece of an old fur rug that the minister's wife gave him one day to carry away because the moths had got into it and she didn't want it any longer, and it made just a splendid bear or a wolf or a lion, only this time it was a fox." "Oh, that old fur rug was fine!" exploded Joel, with sparkling eyes, breaking in. "And one time But Ben pulling him down, Polly was allowed to go on. "Well, the first thing in the play," said Polly briskly, "the little White Rabbit is fast asleep under the tree, and old Mr. Fox comes stealing up behind her and says very softly, 'My dear Miss Rabbit,' and she opens her eyes and wakes up. 'Oh,' she says, 'is that you, Mr. Fox?' And he says, 'Yes, and won't you come home with me and see my little teeny wee foxes?'" "Oh, were there little foxes, Polly Pepper?" cried the Whitney boys delightedly. "Yes, indeed there were," said Polly quickly. "There were 2 little foxes in a hole a little way off. They were Joel and David, you know. They were spectators with me while little White Rabbit was asleep and Mr. Fox was waking her up. Then when he invited her to go and see his little foxes, why, the boys scampered off and got into their hole." "Where was the hole, Polly?" asked Percy. "Oh, we had scooped a place under the bank where the grass grew high," said Polly, "and it made a splendid cave whenever we wanted wild beasts. Only today it was the house of the teeny wee little foxes. Well, so then little White Rabbit said she would go with Mr. Fox and see his little foxes, and he gave her his hand, and off he led her." "Oh, Polly, the little White Rabbit didn't really go with Mr. Fox, did she?" exclaimed little Dick in horror. "Oh, yes, she did, Dickie," said Polly. Then seeing his face, she made haste to add, "But it was Ben, you know, so she wasn't afraid." "Oh, yes, it was Ben," repeated little Dick, hugging himself in relief. "Well, and so off they went to the hole where the teeny wee little foxes were," said Polly, "and the little White Rabbit put her paw in Mr. Fox's paw, and when they got there, Mr. Fox says, 'Now, just step down into my hole where the teeny wee little foxes are, because you can see them so very much better.'" "And did she, Polly, did she?" interrupted little Dick anxiously. "Yes," said Polly, "but the teeny little wee foxes were Joel and David, you know, so they couldn't hurt the little White Rabbit." "Oh, yes, they were Joel and David," said little Dick, drawing a relieved sigh. "Well, when Phronsie, the little White Rabbit, had stepped down into the hole, Up jumps the two teeny little foxes, and they ran past her, and past Mr. Fox as quickly as they could, so as to be audience, you know, because I was the man with the big gun to go out and shoot Mr. Fox, and it was time for him to do it. So Joel and David, the two teeny little wee foxes, sat down on their stone seats, and the man with the big gun picked it up, and he ran to the hole, and just as Mr. Fox was going to eat up the little white rabbit, he put his gun to his shoulder, and bang it went, and over tumbled Mr. Fox, and little white rabbit was safe. It was impossible to describe the excitement that now possessed the entire group, and it was some minutes before anybody could be heard. Then Joel cried, "Polly, tell the rest! Tell the rest!" "Oh, yes," cried Polly with shining eyes. "The best was what came after. What do you think we found when we all raced back? You know I had hold of the little white rabbit's paw, and Mr. Fox was scampering after." "Why, I thought you said when the man's big gun went bang, Mr. Fox tumbled over dead," cried Percy. "Oh, yes, so he did," said Polly coolly, "but he had to jump up, you know, and come and be audience, because then the little foxes were going to try to get the little white rabbit, and you see he had to take their place and look on, or there wouldn't be any spectators." "Oh," said the Whitney boys. "Yes, well, we were all three running along, Mr. Fox just behind, when Joel and David, the little teeny wee foxes, came racing over the grass. 'Oh, Polly Pepper,' they screamed, 'come, come,' and then they turned and flew back. I can tell you we all ran then." "What was it? Oh, what was it?" screamed Percy and Van and little Dick together. "Why, there on the stone lay, what do you think? A big orange and a bag of peanuts." "Oh, dear me!" cried all the Whitney boys, tumbling backward in dreadful disappointment. "Is that all?" gasped Percy. "All!" repeated Polly. "Why, you can't think how perfectly splendid it was to see that big orange, as yellow as gold, and that magnificent bag of peanuts standing there on that stone table. Why, it seemed as if they must have dropped right down from the little puffy white clouds sailing above our heads, for we couldn't imagine where they came from. And we never thought of finishing up our play, but the little white rabbit hopped out of her white skin, and Mr. Fox tumbled out of his old fur rug, and it took us all the rest of the afternoon to cut and divide that splendid big yellow orange, and to count out those magnificent peanuts, and to give them all around, except the time it took to eat them." "That was best!" exclaimed Joel, smacking his lips. "And we saved some for Mamsie," said little Davy. "Didn't we, Polly?" "Why, of course," said Polly. "We all saved the best for her." And Polly kept saying, "I do wish we knew where they came from," every minute or so, said Ben. "But we didn't tell, did we, Dave?" said Joel, chuckling at the remembrance. "No," said little David, "but I wanted to when Polly kept trying to find out." "And did you know?" cried Van, turning on him. "Of course we did," said Joel, puffing with importance. "We knew every single bit of it all, because we were sitting on our stone chairs and we saw it all. Only Polly thought because we didn't tell that they'd been put there before, while we were all at Mr. Fox's hole. But we could keep a secret, couldn't we, Dave?" "Yes," said little Davy slowly. "It never entered our heads that you could keep still if you knew it, Joe," said Ben. "Well, who did put them there?" demanded Van, bursting with impatience. "Why, our good, dearest, and loveliest Dr. Fisher," said Polly with glowing cheeks. "Papa Fisher, only he wasn't Papa Fisher then, he was just Dr. Fisher. Why, here he comes now." End of story 26. End of The Stories Polly Pepper Told to the 5 Little Peppers in the Little Brown House by Margaret Sidney.